was a living legend, a man who redrew the map of Europe with a stroke of his pen. Napoleon Bonaparte convinced the whole world, and above all himself, that his will was stronger than any circumstances, borders, or even nature. His army, assembled from all corners of the continent, seemed like a single indestructible machine capable of crushing any opponent to dust. But history does not forgive pride, and sometimes the greatest empires collapse not from cannonballs, but from a single misstep into the void. 600,000 men crossed the border, their epaulets gleaming with gold and their steel polished to a shine, believing in a quick and glorious victory over their mysterious eastern neighbor. They were not just going to conquer territory, they were going to establish a new world order, with Paris at the center of the universe. However, instead of triumphal arches and keys to cities, they were met with endless horizons, dusty roads, and a silence that was more frightening than the roar of cannons. It was a campaign where the enemy constantly eluded them, and time and space themselves became the enemy's allies. Instead of major battles, the soldiers had to fight hunger, thirst, and their own despair, as each step forward brought them closer to disaster. The Grande Armée began to melt away long before the first frosts, disappearing into the endless fields like water in hot sand. The logistics that worked in cramped Europe fell apart here, turning the march into an endless struggle for survival. This is a story of how one man's ambitions collided with a harsh reality that cannot be defeated with a bayonet. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn what the true cost of the Russian campaign was, and why even the most brilliant strategist is powerless when geography itself rises up against him. What if I told you that the greatest army in history was doomed before it even took its first step? On paper, the Grande Armée looked like a formidable monolith, a force capable of crushing any defense in old Europe. It was a gathering of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of guns, and endless columns of cavalry, the sight of which made the earth tremble. But behind this glittering facade lay a fragile structure woven from contradictions, mistrust, and hidden conflicts. Napoleon gathered under his banners not just the French, but representatives of 12 different nations, many of which had recently been his enemies. Germans, Austrians, Italians, and Poles went into battle not for an idea, but out of coercion or a vague hope for political gain. The language barrier turned the transmission of orders into a complex game of broken telephone, where every mistake could cost the lives of an entire regiment. Officers from different countries struggled to find a common language, and soldiers often viewed each other with greater suspicion than they did their enemies. Discipline was maintained by fear of the emperor and faith in his military genius, which seemed infinite and infallible. Napoleon was accustomed to lightning campaigns where everything was decided by a single powerful blow in a decisive battle. He expected to defeat the Russian army at the border, dictate his terms of peace, and return to Paris a hero before the beginning of autumn. His plans had no room for a protracted war, retreats, or maneuvers thousands of kilometers deep into a foreign country. The arrogance of the headquarters reached such proportions that no one bothered to study in detail the climatic features and quality of the roads in the future theater of war. The maps were inaccurate, the information about the terrain was fragmentary, and the ideas about the enemy's resources were illusory. The generals believed that the methods that had worked in Italy and Austria would also work on the endless plains of the East. This was a mistake based on the confidence that France alone set the rules of the game. In the early days of the campaign, it became clear that it was practically impossible to control such a huge mass of people in the wild terrain. Orders were delayed, columns collided and mixed, creating monstrous traffic jams at narrow crossings. The command system, perfectly tuned for compact European theaters, began to fail under its own weight. Napoleon tried to control everything personally, but the scale of what was happening was beyond human capabilities. Supplies designed for rapid passage through rich provinces began to falter immediately after crossing the Niemen River. Soldiers were accustomed to living off local resources, but here in a sparsely populated area, there was practically nothing to take. Instead of hearty dinners in captured cities, the army was greeted by empty villages and barren fields. The illusion that the war would feed itself was shattered by the harsh reality of poverty in the borderlands. The high morale seen at the parades in Dresden began to decline with every kilometer of the exhausting march to nowhere. Soldiers who did not understand the goals of this distant war began to ask themselves questions that the officers had no answers to. Why weren't the Russians engaging in battle? Where were they going? Where was the promised glory and booty? The Grand Army resembled a colossus with feet of clay, which looked formidable but was ready to collapse at the first serious shock. Napoleon led not a united people, but a motley crowd held together only by his personal authority. And that authority was tested every day by the aimless pursuit of an elusive enemy. It was a campaign not so much against Russia as against common sense in the laws of logistics. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. Do you think such a diverse army could have won a long war, or was defeat just a matter of time? Let me know in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what killed soldiers long before the famous frost set in? We are used to blaming General Winter for everything, imagining snow-covered fields and icy winds. But the real killer of the Grand Army was the summer, the stifling, dusty, and merciless summer of 1812. The heat was so intense that people fainted right in formation, unable to withstand the weight of their cloth uniforms and ammunition. The Russian expanses greeted the conquerors not with armies lined up in formation, but with clouds of suffocating dust raised by thousands of boots and hooves. This dust clogged the lungs, creaked between the teeth, and covered people with a thick layer of gray mud, turning them into ghosts. There was a catastrophic shortage of water, and the few sources encountered along the way instantly turned into a dirty mess. Soldiers drank from puddles and swamps, which immediately led to outbreaks of dysentery and other diseases. The terrain worked against the French with an efficiency that any commander would envy. The Russian army retreated, luring Napoleon deeper and deeper into a trap of endless marches. Every day the French marched dozens of kilometers, hoping to catch up with the enemy, but found only abandoned camps and extinguished campfires. This chase across the horizon was physically exhausting, and even worse, psychologically draining. Horses, the main engine of 19th century warfare, began to die by the thousands from lack of fodder and exhaustion. The green grass they ate was too watery and did not provide the energy needed for heavy work in harness. Without oats under the scorching sun, the cavalry and artillery lost their mobility at an alarming rate. The roads were littered with dead animals, whose bodies decomposed in the heat, poisoning the air. Napoleon tried to force the Russians into a decisive battle, but Barclay de Tolly and Bagration skillfully evaded the blow. They traded territory for time, preserving their army and exhausting their enemy with endless marches. The French emperor found himself in a situation where his tactical genius was useless because there was no one to apply it to. He waved his fists in the void, and his blows only shook the air. The vast distances stretched communications, making the rear vulnerable to attacks by flying squads and Cossacks. It took weeks of dangerous travel to deliver mail or orders from the border to the vanguard. The army, like a giant snake, stretched for hundreds of miles, and its tail no longer knew what its head was doing. Control of the situation was slipping away, dissolving into endless forests and fields. Instead of victory reports, reports of growing losses from disease and desertion were sent to Paris. Soldiers who fell behind their units due to worn-out feet or weakness went missing or fell into the hands of partisans. The Grand Army melted away, not in battle but on the march, leaving behind a trail of broken carts and nameless graves. It was a quiet, inconspicuous extermination, unaccompanied by the roar of cannons. The nature of Russia proved to be a barrier that could not be overcome by bravery or numerical superiority. The landscape dictated its own terms, and those terms were deadly for the European war machine. Every step deeper into the country was a step into the unknown, with no guarantee of return. The space swallowed people, time, and hopes. By midsummer, the army had lost a significant portion of its personnel without even engaging in serious combat. It was a paradox. The conqueror advanced, capturing cities, but grew weaker with each passing day. Victory seemed close, but it was a mirage that receded as it drew nearer. How did this endless march affect what the soldiers ate and how they survived? In the next chapter, you will learn about the logistical nightmare that was the real reason for the collapse. What I am about to show you will shatter your notions of military romance, because it was not bullets that killed the army, but ordinary cartwheels. The main secret of the failure was not hidden in the staff maps, but in the banal incompatibility of European technology and Russian reality. The French supply train was designed for the smooth paved roads of Prussia and Austria, but here it encountered routes that could only loosely be called roads. Heavy wagons loaded with supplies got stuck in the sand up to their hubs or broke their axles on deep potholes. Thousands of carts that were supposed to carry bread, wine, and ammunition simply stopped, unable to overcome the Russian road conditions. This led to the instant collapse of the entire supply system. The advance units had gone far ahead, while the food remained somewhere behind, stuck in the carts. Soldiers, accustomed to regular rations, suddenly found themselves on the verge of starvation in the middle of a foreign country. They had to eat unripe grain, grind it with stones, and bake flatbread on campfires, which caused mass poisoning. The logistics that Napoleon was so proud of turned into chaos, with no one knowing where the supplies were or how to deliver them. Quartermasters panicked and tried to requisition carts from local peasants, but these were too primitive and small for the needs of a huge army. Instead of organized supply, a spontaneous struggle for resources began, in which the strong took from the weak. Discipline was falling apart when it came to a piece of bread or a sip of wine. The lack of supplies affected not only the soldiers' stomachs, but also the combat effectiveness of the entire army. There was a shortage of spare horseshoes, nails, leather for repairing boots, and ammunition. Small things without which an army becomes a crowd of ragged beggars. The soldiers marched in falling apart shoes, their feet bleeding, which made every step a torment. Weapons needed maintenance, but there was no oil or rags, and the guns began to rust. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the huge herds of cattle that followed the army, as a living supply of meat, could not keep up with the pace of the march. Cows and bulls lost weight, collapsed from exhaustion, and became unfit for food before they could be slaughtered. The meat, if it appeared at all, was often tough and spoiled, adding to the workload of field doctors. Hunger became a soldier's constant companion, more reliable than luck. Looting, which was initially severely punished, soon became the only way for ordinary soldiers to survive. Groups of foragers scattered throughout the surrounding area in search of any food they could find, often never returning. This eroded discipline, turning organized regiments into gangs roaming the forests. Officers turned a blind eye to this, realizing that they could not feed their men according to regulations. Napoleon demanded speed, but speed killed the supply train, severing the thin thread connecting the army to its bases. The further east they went, the thinner this supply stream became, until it dried up completely. The army was devouring itself, consuming resources that could not be replenished. It was a race against time, where the stakes were not victory, but dinner. Even water, a seemingly accessible resource, became a problem due to the lack of proper containers for its transport and storage. Wine barrels dried out and leaked, and there was nowhere to get new ones. Soldiers drank anything that burned, just to numb their hunger and fear of the unknown. Alcohol became a substitute for food and warmth. This entire gigantic machine, created for war, was stuck in mud and dust, defeated by the lack of road infrastructure. A cartwheel that broke on a bump near Vitebsk contributed no less to the victory over Napoleon than the cannons at Borodino. It was a triumph of geography over technology. Like if you are also amazed at how such simple things can determine the fate of entire empires. Guess how long it took the French to realize that they were capturing ashes? The Russian strategy of retreat was not just a military maneuver, but the total destruction of everything that could be of use to the enemy. Scorched earth. This term took on a frightening reality when the French entered villages and saw only smoldering embers. The peasants, as they left, burned their houses, barns with grain, and even haystacks in the fields. Napoleon hoped to find bases for rest and replenishment of supplies in the captured cities, but found only empty shells of buildings. Smolensk, an ancient fortress city, met the conquerors with fire and destruction, denying them the respite they desired. It was psychologically unbearable. To win, to capture territory, but to gain no benefit from it. The spoils were emptiness, black and lifeless. As they withdrew, Russian troops and civilians destroyed bridges, crossings, and wells, forcing the French to expend precious energy on rebuilding them. Engineering troops worked tirelessly to keep the army moving forward, but the destruction was too great. Every kilometer of the journey came at the cost of enormous effort, which could not be rewarded. It was a war against infrastructure that was already almost non-existent. French soldiers were shocked by the determination of the Russian people to destroy their own property in order to defeat the enemy. In Europe, wars were fought differently. Cities surrendered in order to preserve their architecture and way of life, and contributions were paid. Here, however, the logic of absolute irreconcilability prevailed, where material values were worth nothing compared to independence. This frightened and caused superstitious horror among Europeans. The lack of shelter meant that hundreds of thousands of people were forced to sleep under the open sky. Rain, cold nights, and dampness undermined the health of the army more than direct combat. Hospitals were overcrowded, but there was nothing and nowhere to treat the sick. The scorched earth deprived the army of the opportunity to recover. Napoleon was chasing a ghost, trying to impose his rules of the game on an enemy who refused to play by the rules. He was looking for a foothold, but each time he stepped into emptiness. The Russian army was always one step ahead, leaving only smoke and ashes behind. This wore on the nerves of the emperor, who was accustomed to quick and decisive outcomes. This tactic deprived the French of the most important thing, a sense of security in the conquered territory. They felt like strangers everywhere, surrounded by hostile emptiness. Even in the captured cities, they were not masters, but only temporary guests on the ashes. The rear ceased to exist as a concept. The front was everywhere and nowhere. Fires became a constant backdrop to this campaign, illuminating the path of the Grand Army with an ominous crimson light. During the day, the sky was covered with black smoke, and at night the horizon was ablaze with the glow of burning villages. This created an apocalyptic picture that weighed heavily on the soldiers' psyche. It seemed as if they had descended into hell, where fire consumed all living things. The strategy of Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov was cruel, but the only correct one in those circumstances. It deprived Napoleon of resources, turning his numerical advantage into a disadvantage. The huge army needed to be fed, but there was no food. Victory over space proved impossible without the support of the land. What would you have done in the residence place? Burned your house so that it would not fall into enemy hands, or tried to save your property? This is a difficult question, to which history has given a harsh answer. The general battle that Napoleon so desired finally took place, but it did not bring the relief he had hoped for. Borodino became a meat grinder, a giant slaughterhouse where people, horses, and metal mingled in thick gunpowder smoke. It was not a battle of maneuvers and cunning, but a head-on collision of two colossal forces. Artillery on both sides plowed the earth, leaving no living thing on the battlefield. The French emperor, usually energetic and omnipresent, was ill and passive that day, directing the battle from afar. He could not see the field behind the wall of smoke, and his orders were often delayed or did not correspond to the changing situation. Napoleon never decided to bring his last reserve, the Old Guard, into battle, fearing the loss of the army's elite far from France. This decision may have cost him complete victory, turning the outcome of the battle into a bloody draw. Russian soldiers stood to the death, showing a steadfastness that impressed even the experienced veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. Redoubts changed hands, littered with the bodies of defenders and attackers in several layers. This was not a duel between armies, but a brutal fight in which the winner was the one who was willing to pay the highest price in blood. The roar of the cannonade could be heard for tens of kilometers, heralding the tragedy. The losses were monstrous on both sides. Tens of thousands of dead and wounded remained on the field. The French army, already exhausted by the campaign, lost the cream of its cavalry and its best officers. Napoleon formally won the victory as the Russians retreated, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The enemy was not defeated. Its army retained its order and fighting spirit. After the battle, the field was a gruesome sight that demoralized even the most hardened warriors. The cries of the wounded, who had no one to evacuate them, pierced the silence of the night. The French medical service could not cope with the flow of casualties, and many died from lack of help. It was a triumph of death, not military art. Borodino did not open the way to peace. It only opened the way to Moscow, which became a new trap for Napoleon. He expected that after such a massacre, the Russian Tsar would request negotiations, but he was mistaken. The Russian army withdrew to conserve its strength, leaving the French with a field soaked in blood. It was a strategic retreat that cost more than any attack. A feeling of incompleteness hung in the air. The sacrifice had been made, but the result had not been achieved. The soldiers understood that the war was not over and that uncertainty lay ahead. There was no euphoria of victory, only deadly fatigue and apathy. The Grand Army entered this battle as a single organism and emerged from it as a wounded beast. The French generals were horrified by what they saw. They had never encountered such fury and such disregard for death in Europe. It became clear that this war could not be won with a single blow, as they were accustomed to doing. The rules had changed, and the price of success had become prohibitively high. Borodino became the point of no return. The army continued its march eastward, leaving thousands of its comrades behind. They were heading for the holy city of Moscow, hoping to find rest and an end to the war there. But they did not yet know that the most terrible ordeal awaited them ahead, beyond the walls of the ancient capital. Expectations of an easy finale melted away in the gunpowder smoke of Borodino. Illusions finally collapsed, giving way to the harsh reality of a war of annihilation. Are you ready for the shocking truth? The capture of the enemy's capital was the beginning of the end for the victors. Moscow appeared before Napoleon not as a defeated city offering up its keys, but as an extinct giant. The streets were empty, the houses abandoned, and the silence rang in their ears, broken only by the footsteps of the soldiers. It was like entering a ghost town, and it evoked not triumph, but anxiety. But the real nightmare began when the first fires broke out. Wooden Moscow burned from several ends at once, set on fire, as the French believed, by the inhabitants themselves or by saboteurs. The fire spread at a terrifying speed, turning the city into a sea of flames. Instead of resting, the soldiers were forced to fight the flames or flee from them, running from street to street. A bacchanalia of looting and chaos began in the burning city, which the command could not stop. Soldiers dragged expensive furs, paintings, and silver from the palaces, but could not find simple bread. They dressed themselves in silk and velvet over their dirty uniforms, looking like a carnival procession of madmen. Gold and jewels lay at their feet, but they lost their value when there was nothing to eat. The army was disintegrating before our eyes, turning into a bunch of looters weighed down by useless booty. Discipline collapsed completely. Orders were ignored. Officers lost their authority. Instead of regaining their strength, the troops lost what little fighting ability they had left to drunkenness and looting. Moscow, which was supposed to be their base for the winter, burned to the ground, depriving the army of shelter. Napoleon watched the burning city from the Kremlin, and in the reflections of the flames, he saw the collapse of his hopes. He understood that the situation was out of control and that he was trapped. He had the city, but he did not have victory. He had the army, but he did not have supplies. It was a strategic impasse from which there was no good way out. The fire destroyed huge food reserves that could have fed the army through the winter. Now the French faced the prospect of starvation amid the ruins. Hopes for a comfortable winter were reduced to ashes along with the Moscow estates. The army was left in ruins, without shelter and without clear prospects. The psychological blow was devastating. The soldiers felt cornered. They had marched thousands of kilometers, won battles, and captured the capital, but ended up with nothing. A sense of futility gripped everyone, from the rank and file to the marshal. Moscow did not surrender. It simply left, leaving its empty shell to the enemy. Instead of a diplomatic triumph, Napoleon was faced with a humanitarian catastrophe. He had to feed tens of thousands of people in a city where nothing was left alive. The illusion of control disappeared, giving way to chaos and anarchy. The Grand Army became a hostage to its own victory. It was a moment of truth when it became clear that military force was powerless against total popular war. Moscow was not a prize, it was a curse. The French found themselves in the heart of Russia, but Russia rejected them. But if the fire was terrible, what awaited them when the flames died down? In the next chapter, you will learn how the weather decided to finish off those who survived the fire. Napoleon spent more than a month in Moscow, 35 endless days that became the most expensive of his life. He sat in the Kremlin, waiting for Alexander I's envoys with a peace proposal, confident that the loss of the capital would break the spirit of the Russian Tsar. The emperor wrote letters, offered lenient terms, but received only deafening silence in response. This wait was a painful self-deception, a paralysis of will that shackled the actions of the great commander. While Napoleon waited, time worked against him with the inexorability of a clockwork mechanism. Autumn was coming into its own. The days were getting shorter, the nights colder, and the rains were washing away the roads. The Russian army under Kutuzov's command was resting, replenishing its ranks, and gathering strength in the Tarutino camp. Kutuzov understood the situation perfectly and simply waited for the French to drive themselves into a corner. Every day of delay brought the inevitable catastrophe closer, but Napoleon refused to believe the obvious. He could not imagine that a monarch would sacrifice his capital and not ask for peace. It did not fit into the logic of European politics. Pride prevented him from admitting his mistake and giving the order to retreat while the weather was still good. He clung to the illusion of control while reality slipped through his fingers. In Moscow itself, the situation was becoming critical. Food was running out, and partisans were intercepting supply convoys. Detachments sent for food returned empty-handed or did not return at all. The army found itself blockaded in the center of the captured country, isolated and blind. The mood among the troops changed from triumphant to decadent. Inaction undermined discipline more than defeat. Soldiers loitered among the ruins, traded loot, and dreamed of home. The fighting spirit that could have saved them in a difficult moment evaporated into idleness. The army turned into a camp, overloaded with baggage and deprived of purpose. Napoleon weighed his options: march on St. Petersburg, return to Smolensk, or winter in southern Russia. But each plan was thwarted by a lack of resources and the impossibility of resupply. He found himself in a strategic vacuum where every decision seemed bad, and he chose the worst possible option: to do nothing and wait. This sitting in the Kremlin became a symbol of the collapse of Napoleon's strategy. He was used to dictating terms, but here the terms were dictated by the enemy's silence. Alexander I showed a firmness that Napoleon had not expected. The psychological duel between the two emperors was won by the Russian Tsar without even entering into dialogue. When the order to leave Moscow was finally given, it was already hopelessly late. Precious time that could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives was wasted waiting for a letter that never came. Autumn was ending and winter was on the threshold, ready to reap its harvest. Nature was preparing its response to the delay, and that response was merciless. Napoleon had missed the moment when he could have left with dignity. Now he had to flee for his life. 35 days of silence in the Kremlin proved more deadly than the roar of cannons at Borodino. It was a pause before the final act of the tragedy. When the Grand Army finally left Moscow, it resembled a giant caravan of refugees rather than a military force. The columns stretched for tens of kilometers, crammed with carriages, carts loaded with looted goods, women, and civilians. Soldiers carried useless items such as porcelain, silk, and statuettes, while discarding necessary supplies. Greed fought common sense and greed won, slowing the movement to a snail's pace. Napoleon attempted to break through to the south, to the provinces rich in grain and untouched by war, via Kaluga. It was a chance to save the army, feed the men and horses, and retreat along a normal road. But at Maloyaroslavets, he was met by Kutuzov's strengthened army, which blocked the path to salvation. A fierce battle during which the city changed hands 8 times showed that the Russians would not let the enemy pass to the south. The French emperor was faced with a difficult choice: to fight his way through, risking the loss of the remnants of his army, or to turn back. At a council in Gorodnya, he made the fateful decision to retreat along the old Smolensk road, the very road they had come along in the summer, and which they themselves had destroyed completely. It was a journey through a scorched desert where there was no food, no shelter, and no hope. The turn towards Smolensk was a psychological breakdown for the entire army. The soldiers realized that they were not maneuvering, but fleeing, and that hunger awaited them ahead. The surrounding area was familiar, but now it looked like a graveyard. Burned villages, dug up graves, bones of fallen horses. The ghosts of the summer offensive stared at them from the roadside. Kutuzov pursued the retreating army in a parallel march, without engaging in major battles, but constantly harassing the flanks. Cossacks and partisans attacked those who lagged behind, cut off supply trains, and sowed panic. The French felt like prey being hunted by hunters, not given a moment's rest. The fear of encirclement drove them forward, not allowing them to stop and rest. Discipline began to collapse at a catastrophic rate. Regiments became mixed up. Soldiers threw away their weapons to make it easier to carry their loot or simply to walk. Officers lost control of their subordinates, who listened only to the voice of their stomachs. Everyone's sole goal became personal survival. The hope that there were food supplies in Smolensk kept people going on this terrible journey. They walked, dreaming of warm shelter and bread, not knowing that the warehouses were empty or looted. This false hope was the only fuel that kept the tired soldiers' feet moving. Every day it got colder, and the first frost froze the mud, turning the road into a skating rink. Horses slipped and broke their legs, and they were immediately shot and eaten, their carcasses torn to pieces. Artillery and wagons had to be abandoned, as there was no one to pull them. The army began to shed excess weight, leaving behind in the mud the cannons that had once been its pride and joy. Returning to the old road was a death sentence. Napoleon single-handedly sent hundreds of thousands of people into an icy hell from which there was no escape. The circle was complete. They returned to where it all began, but they were completely different people now. The retreat turned into a flight, where the enemy was not only the Russian soldier, but also every step on the ravaged land. The snow fell quietly and unnoticed, as if nature wanted to lull the conquerors into a false sense of security. But with the appearance of the first white flakes, the world changed forever and irrevocably for the Grand Army. The air temperature began to drop rapidly, falling lower and lower with each passing hour. The famous Russian frosts, which the French had been warned about but did not believe, struck the people with all their merciless force. Soldiers dressed in light European uniforms, designed for parades and summer campaigns, found themselves in an icy trap. The soldiers of the Grand Army had neither warm sheepskin coats, nor felt boots, nor fur hats. Trying to keep warm somehow, they put on whatever they could find in the plundered supply trains or villages. The soldiers wrapped themselves in colorful women's shawls, expensive carpets stolen from Moscow palaces, and even gold-embroidered priestly vestments. The once glorious army had turned into a crowd of costumed ghosts wandering through an endless white fog. The cold was not just an annoying nuisance. It became a real physical torture that did not stop for a single minute. The icy wind penetrated to the bone, turning every movement into suffering. The metal of the gun barrels burned their hands in the cold, instantly freezing to their skin and tearing it down to the flesh. Because of this, many soldiers simply threw their weapons into the snowdrifts, preferring to travel light but save their fingers. Sleeping under the open sky became a death sentence for many. Exhausted people sat down by the fire, hoping to warm up, and fell into a deep sleep. Those who fell asleep too close to the fire burned without feeling pain, and those who were a little further away often did not wake up in the morning. People froze to death on the march, collapsing exhausted into the deep snow. They were immediately swept away by the blizzard, forever erasing any trace of their existence on this earth. Horses, unaccustomed to such a climate and deprived of food, died by the thousands. They could not withstand the lack of food and the icy wind that pierced their hides. Their hooves slipped on the icy road, and the animals broke their legs, after which they had to be shot. Without horses, the entire renowned cavalry and artillery came to a standstill, turning into ordinary infantry. Cavalrymen, untrained for long marches in heavy boots, suffered the most. Fallen animals became the only source of food and warmth for the exhausted men. Soldiers cut open the bellies of still warm horses to use their entrails to warm their frozen hands and feet. It was a horrific scene of primitive survival, where civilized man instantly lost all his cultural polish. The hunger reached truly monstrous proportions, driving people mad. It forced soldiers to chew on tough leather straps, boil the soles of old boots, and eat tallow candles found in churches. Fights over a piece of raw horse meat were more fierce and bloody than battles with Russian troops. Everything human disappeared from the soldiers' glazed eyes, leaving only a wild animal instinct for self-preservation. The concepts of frontline friendship and loyalty lost all meaning in the face of starvation. Comrades could walk past a fallen friend without even trying to help him, just so as not to waste precious energy. The road to the west turned into an icy corridor of death, thickly strewn with the corpses of people, horses, and abandoned equipment. And from the snowy fog, like demons of winter, flying detachments of Cossacks constantly swooped down. The Cossacks, on their hardy horses, delivered quick and painful blows with their pikes and then immediately disappeared into the blizzard. They gave the French no moment's peace, keeping them in constant tension and fear. The Russian irregular cavalry drove the retreating troops like a herd, cutting off those who lagged behind and mercilessly finishing off the weak. The fear of Russian captivity was great, but the fear of the pervasive cold was even stronger. The city of Smolensk, on which the French command had pinned so many hopes, turned out to be a bitter disappointment. There were almost no food supplies there, as the supply system had collapsed, and the few crumbs that were still in the warehouses were looted by a frenzied crowd of soldiers in the first hours after entering the city. The organized distribution of food completely failed, and instead, bloody chaos and looting began. The last hope for salvation and rest collapsed, and black despair overwhelmed the army with new, even greater force. Napoleon, riding in a closed carriage and dressed in a warm sable coat, was increasingly distancing himself from his soldiers. He saw through the window how his great creation was slowly dying in the Russian snows, but he was completely powerless to change anything. His orders, once the law for all of Europe, now meant nothing in the face of the raging elements. Now General Winter and General Famine had taken command of this tragic parade. The silence of the winter forest was broken only by the howling of the wind in the treetops and the crunch of snow under the feet of thousands of doomed people. It was an eerie, silent procession of the dead, who were still formally breathing and moving, but in essence were already doomed. Nature once again demonstrated its complete and overwhelming superiority over pitiful human ambitions. The white icy desert slowly engulfed the army, erasing any distinctions between high ranks and nationalities. In the face of 40 degrees below zero, everyone was equal, from the renowned marshal to the ordinary private. Berezina. This word has forever become synonymous with complete disaster in the French language and the final chord of a great tragedy. The remnants of the Grande Armée, trapped between pursuing Russian troops on three sides and a wide frozen river, found themselves in a deadly trap. The fixed bridges had been destroyed, and it seemed that there was no escape. It seemed that here and now the history of Napoleon's campaign would end in complete destruction or shameful captivity for all. The river was not completely frozen, and huge ice floes floated on it, making it impossible to cross by swimming. However, it was at this hopeless moment that the last bright flash of heroism and engineering genius of the French army manifested itself. Dutch pontoon builders under the command of General Eblé performed a real feat. These brave men, standing chest and neck deep in icy water, built temporary bridges under artillery fire and amid floating ice floes. They worked in 15-minute shifts because it was impossible to endure longer, but many died right in the water from hypothermia. The engineers consciously sacrificed themselves, knowing that this was the only chance for the emperor and the army. It was the greatest feat of self-sacrifice, which allowed the combat-ready part of the army to cross to the other, safe shore. But the crossing itself very quickly turned into a scene of absolute inhuman horror and chaos. Tens of thousands of people, carts, carriages, and horses rushed toward two narrow, flimsy bridges. In a panic, they crushed each other, throwing the weak into the black water. The crowd, maddened by fear, swept away everything in its path, without regard for the road. People fell from the bridges into the icy water and immediately drowned, dragged under the ice by their heavy clothing in the fast current. The cries of thousands merged into a single howl that drowned out even the roar of Russian artillery. Russian cannons began firing accurately at the crossing, turning the bridges into a bloody mess of wood and human bodies. Cannonballs smashed carts, creating jams that were impossible to clear. Napoleon managed to cross one of the first with his guard, leaving behind the bulk of his troops. A huge tail of tens of thousands of stragglers, wounded soldiers, and civilians remained on the eastern bank. When it became clear that the Russians were closing in, a cruel order was given to set fire to the bridges to cut off the enemy's retreat. Thousands of people remained on the other side, now finally doomed to captivity or a painful death. Their desperate pleas for help were drowned out by the crackling of the fire and the roar of the icy water, but no one turned back. The Berezina became a giant mass grave for the last hopes of the French Empire. After this crossing, the army effectively ceased to exist as an organized military force. Now they were just scattered groups of armed, ragged men wandering westward. Each of them thought only of saving their own lives and getting a piece of bread. After the crossing, the frost struck even harder, finishing off those who had gotten wet in the water but miraculously made it to shore. The road from the river was thickly strewn with the bodies of people who had frozen to death. Many of them sat or lay in unnatural positions, like eerie ice statues placed along the way. The emperor, realizing that the Russian campaign was lost once and for all, made a difficult decision. He decided to abandon the pitiful remnants of his army and rush to Paris as quickly as possible. Napoleon left his loyal soldiers to die in the snow in order to save his faltering throne and recruit a new army for future wars. Later, he would utter his famous phrase that it is only a short step from greatness to ridicule. But that single step cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who believed in his genius. His secret departure was the final, crushing blow to the morale of the few who still believed in their idol. The soldiers felt abandoned to their fate in this icy hell. The statistics of this disaster still horrify historians. Of the 600,000 men who crossed the Niemen River in the hot summer, only a pitiful few return. According to various estimates, between 30,000 and 50,000 men left Russia, most of them crippled or seriously ill. The Grand Army, which had terrorized all of Europe, simply dissolved into the endless Russian expanses. It disappeared as quickly and without a trace as the morning fog disappears under the rays of the sun. This tragic campaign became a cruel lesson for the whole world for many centuries. It showed that it is impossible to wage war against harsh nature and a united people at the same time with impunity. The excessive ambitions of one man led to one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the 19th century. Russia remained unconquered, and the myth of Napoleon's invincibility was forever buried in the deep snows near the Berezina River. History had come full circle. The invasion that began with glitz, gold, and pride ended in dead silence and oblivion. The story of Napoleon's campaign in Russia is not just a chronicle of military operations, but a grand warning about the price of human pride. We saw how self-confidence and disregard for reality can destroy the most powerful force on the planet. 400,000 lives were lost not for freedom or the defense of the homeland, but for the mistake of one man who thought he could dictate his rules to the world. Logistics, climate, and the determination of the people proved stronger than ingenious strategies and artillery. This lesson is still relevant today. No technology or ambition can prevail if it does not take into account the laws of nature and the human spirit. Napoleon lost his army not in battle, but on the road, losing the war to himself. What other great historical mistakes would you like to learn about in our next issues? Write your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new stories about how our world has changed.